Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Hello, this is the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast hosted by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am their host, Ethan, like I do every Friday. And we're going to get into some interesting fantasy talks. Today, we're going to be covering some stuff like Eli, and we're going to be talking about some interesting Pro Bowl news. So Pro Bowl is trying to change some stuff that possibly could get into the regular season. Some quarterback stats from this previous year statistics, and just looking at what might be the future of quarterbacks in fantasy football, or maybe that has been the case for the past few years, and get on some Chiefs and 49ers talk, just because they are the Super Bowl contenders right now, and a little bit about Denver's offensive chances, because Denver has an interesting team from last year. As far as I was watching them a lot, as I own two of their players in different respective leagues. So I wanted to look at those two guys, as in Philip Lindsey and Cortland Sutton, just to see what possibility they could have for next season. But first, let me check my notes here. We're gonna get into some Eli Manning. So Eli Manning, two-time Super Bowl MVP, two-time Super Bowl champion quarterback for the New York Football Giants, has basically said he's retiring, and he will be giving out a statement this Friday, which by the time this podcast comes out, it will be on Friday. So I know the common conception right now is that Eli was a wishy-washy quarterback, or maybe he was a little bit of Jekyll and Hyde, and it was more Hyde than Dr. Jekyll than during the twilight of his career, right? So in reality, I guess everybody's like, is Eli a Hall of Famer? They've been asking, is Eli a Hall of Famer for the past 4 years now, and you say, oh, Eli ruined Odell's chances, or even some people think that Eli wasn't that bad, and Odell kind of made some mistakes on his own. But at the end of the day, people have not really given Eli the credit that I guess he deserves. I think he gets a lot of bad rep as a QB just because of the interceptions and a lot of people meme him out. But honestly, when he was at his best, he was good, and I think he was consistent enough to stay a starter for as long as he did, from 2004 to, I guess, 2018. That's a long time. And he played the game with a lot of class and a lot of poise. And, it's hard to be in a market like New York and perform well. And he came and gave Super Bowls. Now, that's something that not a lot of people can really say. When you look at just the New York sports in general, there's the New York Football Giants, there's the Yankees, there's the Rangers. When you look at that, and the Knicks, of course, I forgot the Knicks, but New York likes to win. The Yankees are winners. They don't like to lose, and their fans don't accept losing. When you look at the Giants, they've been under fire for a little bit for the past few years, just because they haven't been competitive, and they've been kind of in a rebuilding stage. Their defense hasn't been as good. Eli has been on a consistent decline, and it hasn't been fun for New York Giants fans. There's not a lot. There hasn't been a lot to watch besides really the Yankees in New York, so to speak. I can't really speak on the Rangers because I don't really watch hockey that much, so I'm not as familiar. So apologize to New York Rangers fans if you guys are actually doing quite well for yourselves. But I know for a fact the Knicks are just not a good basketball club, and they haven't been for a very, very long time. So New York Giants, they're the only guys that look like, besides the Yankees, to have some hope of bringing something, a product that is worth your time and effort, worth your taxes, worth your dollars, worth your time and free time. Because free time is one of the most valuable things that you can ever use, or I guess your time, rather, is the most valuable asset that you have in life, I believe. So if you spend some of your time trying to watch a team that is not good, it can be pretty frustrating. So I think when Eli was good, coming back to this now, and when he was when the Giants were good, it was a good thing. It was a lot of fun to watch. Now, if you look at some of his stats, some of them are good, some of them are kind of but I guess you have to look at it through a whole in a contextual lens. So one of the stats would be he's 19th in adjusted yards per attempt. So that doesn't mean too much because at the top echelon is Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, all of that. Those guys get like 7 yards per attempt adjusted, right? And Eli's is like a 6 point something. And so there's a lot of like small decimal points in between those guys. So 19th in a scale like that, it just looks like a bad number, but in reality, it's not as horrible as you would think. He has a career 60 completion percentage. He has 57,000 yards career. That's 7th all time. And just he has 7th all time in touchdowns with 336 that's completions. He has one interesting stat that I believe that a lot of people don't really look at is he has 37 game-winning drives. That's, I believe, in the top 10 of game-winning drives in the National Football League ever from a quarterback. So clearly he was able to do a lot of clutch stuff in his career. This is just career stats. These are not even looking at his playoff numbers. But he was probably one of those all-time hot streak guys. And, he would be pretty serviceable at majority of his career. And at the end of the day, when he was on, it was something really special. And, of course, we all remember the Tyree catch, and we remember the Victor Cruz era where we beat the Patriots twice. And, that was something that they were just the biggest underdogs, especially the first one. No one ever thought they would do that. And he just kind of got hot. It's kind of like how Joe Flacco was. Joe Flacco got hot on his playoff run, and that's what got him paid so much money, right? I wouldn't say, now, let's not mistake a few things, that Joe Flacco is not, I don't believe Joe Flacco is a Hall of Famer, and I don't believe he's on the same pedestal that is Eli Manning, for one, even though he's won a ring. It's just his career kind of plummeted quite sufficiently in the last 5 years, and that last few years in Baltimore were just not pretty, and I just don't believe he'll ever really get inside the Hall of Fame. Eli, however, I don't know if he's first ballot, but I think he's a Hall of Famer, and I don't see why that's such a controversial thing to believe. A lot of people are, Eli, he only has 2 championship rings. Why can't he be a Hall of Famer? That doesn't even make sense. Well, it's insane how quarterbacks these days, I just saw a really interesting tweet. I wish I remembered the name. But a lot of people criticize quarterbacks who have good seasons, good stats on a regular basis, but don't win, essentially, don't get Super Bowls. But when a guy who has two of them, all of a sudden is not enough. So which one really is it? So for me, I think Eli is a no-brainer for the Hall of Fame. I don't know about first ballot, but he's definitely going to get in there when he's eligible. So that's really how I feel about that. So we're going to take a break, and then after coming back, we're going to talk about some Pro Bowl news as far as what type of rule changes are going to be implemented in the Pro Bowl that potentially could change the landscape of the league for the near future. That's coming up.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, so coming back in, the Pro Bowl, there's been news about said Pro Bowl this year where they are going to be removing the idea of onside kicks, and we're not going to see it at all. So, well, not just onside kicks. I believe it's applied to kickoffs as well. So, essentially, instead of, I guess, if you wanted to get the ball back, you'd have to do an onside kick in regular football terms or NFL standard rules. So that is no more in the Pro Bowl. What you are allowed to do now, if you want to get the ball back, you get the ball on your own 25, and it's a 4th and 15 yards to get the first down. You get one attempt, and if you get the 15 yards, if you get the first down, you keep the ball and you can continue the drive. If you fail, the other team gets the ball on your own 25, or on your own 25, and they get to do what they want to do. Now, granted, if you choose to elect to not do this option, the other team, I believe, gets the ball at their own 25-yard line. So essentially, they're taking out the kickoffs from the game. And honestly, I'm not too sure how I really feel about this, just because it seems like a way to remove kickoffs from football and make scoring more exciting and have a chance for more comebacks and probably to draw a little bit more viewership in for. Because, if there's more exciting games and more chances for teams to come back and win, then at the end of the day, it would drive up viewership, I would believe. I'm not too sure exactly where this is going to go. So this was proposed by the Broncos last season, or last offseason. And a lot of the owners thought that this would be too gimmicky and it wouldn't really lead to anything, but in a 7-1 vote, they proposed it for a trial, and they're going to see how this goes. And the idea for when it was proposed is this would be, like in regular game scenario, this would be a one-time use only sort of thing. So if you wanted to do so they would imply it on like onside kick wise. So it would be if you wanted to get the ball back, a chance to score, get an onside kick. In normal football terms, this would instead replace it by doing the 4th and 15. Now, that, I guess, in theory sounds really interesting because it's not like you do it every single time. I don't like the idea of the kickoff being kind of taken out the game because two things. That takes a lot of people out of the league, essentially. There's a lot of guys who make a living being kickoff specialists, special team specialists. So guys like Devin Hester and guys like DeJounte Harris and even people who are gunners off of kickoffs and such. Those guys have a place in this league. They work really hard to keep those type of positions, and they don't see the field as much in traditional skill positions or even on the defensive end. But at the end of the day, if you remove these guys from that all the time, where are they going to go? Because they don't see the field as often, so maybe that means there'll be more practice squad guys, or they would just not be around as much. So maybe that means that the talent would be kind of greater in the league. I'm not too sure. Would that mean they cut down roster sizes, and then it would probably mean that a lot of guys would go to, I guess, the other leagues, so the XFL maybe. I don't know. But I would hope that it wouldn't affect the game as much as it may seem. So I believe the Pro Bowl the Pro Bowl version is I guess not a hot fix, but a trial run. So they're just going to test it all game. And the one that was proposed is the more realistic version. So I guess that's why they think it's more of a gimmick, because it's only a one-time thing instead of doing it every single time. So maybe the way I have to look at it is the ramifications for this is potentially that teams that are really good offensively and they have kind of shaky defenses. So let's say the Chiefs from last year, if they got something like this, right? It'd be really hard for them to lose, and essentially. But you would think a 4th and 15 is really hard, but guys who are supposed to be these offensive aficionados, these quarterback guru guys, these guys in the league who are supposed to be supreme play callers, they'd probably be licking their chops at this sort of stuff. Granted, it's a really high risk reward type of gamble, but at the end of the day, if implemented in the right way, if you're trying to do an onside kick, that's pretty much a big risk gamble in of itself. And we've seen a lot of onside kicks work. In fact, we saw 3 of them. The Falcons did it this season. They got 3 onside kicks against the Saints. That was hilarious. But maybe their kicker loses value now because they won't be doing it as much. That's more of a joke, but let's just see where... I'm excited to see where it goes. I'm not against watching it. The Pro Bowl hasn't been interesting for a long time. Guys don't try as hard. It's more of a, hey, we're all celebrities and we get to sign autographs and have fun. I'm sure it's a really good fan event, but it's not a football game, really. I don't know what it is, but it's not real football. So it's interesting to watch quarterbacks, I guess, throw the balls and see all the throws that they can make. But there's no real pursuit. There's no hard tackling. There's not a lot of scheming going on as much as you would see in a regular football game. So maybe it'd be interesting. And if from a gambling perspective, it might be interesting. And also just from a fantasy perspective, now this is where things change. From a fantasy perspective, if they were to implement what they do in the Pro Bowl, which is every time, that's when things start to get really, really effective for fantasy players who are just going to keep piling on the points. Just imagine if a team is so confident that they don't kick it off anymore, or they just keep going for it. I guess that would be really abusive to teams that have really bad defenses. So I would hope that wouldn't happen. But in theory, that would just be really, really, really crazy. Like, could you imagine a scenario where Christian McCaffrey touches the ball 4 straight possessions without ever going to the sideline? That would be insane. So I'm interested to see how it really affects the Pro Bowl. But as a fan of football, I would not like it to be an abusive tactic. And maybe it is more of a gimmick than a actual, quality solution to kickoffs. And maybe it's for trying to reduce concussions and trying to make the game more safe. But I think there's a line to safety in a sport like football, right? There's knowledge that things are going to happen. Not everything, won't be safe 100% of the time. It's a very physical sport. It's a very high contact, high speed type of sport. So there's a difference between making football safe and basically changing what football is, or what the essence of football is. And the essence of football is a contact sport, a tackling sport, high intensity, high effort, and everybody's flying around. Now, there's a difference between teaching people how to tackle different, not leading with the crown of their head, and removing an aspect of the game that's been in for the entirety of the game. So I think it's an interesting take, but I don't know if it'll stay. And maybe for our fantasy folks, this would be something that we would like to see, but I'm not too sure yet. But I'm going to take a break, and coming out, we're going to talk about some Chiefs 49ers, and more specifically, I want to talk about Chiefs just because I'm really not too sure who's going to win the Super Bowl, but we're going to talk about that. That's coming up.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the Chiefs and their really, really strong chance of being Super Bowl champions, and what this could mean for Patrick Mahomes, and what this could mean for people like Travis Kelce, and just legacy stuff. And really, I'm not sure if anybody can stop the Chiefs. And that's hard to say after watching the 49ers basically run through the playoffs as a defensive really masterclass of showing what it looks like to really put pressure on quarterbacks and stop people from doing what they have done all season long, as they shut down Dalvin Cook. So essentially they shut down the Vikings' whole offense, right? And literally the next week they took Aaron Rodgers. Even though Aaron Rodgers had a decent game, you can definitely see that it was not the game. It was not the same Aaron Rodgers that we see, who was able to dissect the defense with ease. That defense was not being dissected as much. And you can see there's a lot of pressure put on him. And they weren't able to get anything going for most of the game. By the time they did get some stuff going, the game was essentially over. It was more like garbage time, last minute quarter stuff. So, what does that mean for the Chiefs? Now, the Chiefs, what they've done is essentially reminded the league, or reminded football fans and football watchers alike, that they are as dominant as they choose to be at any given moment in time. When the season first started, the Chiefs were probably the favorite, maybe behind the Patriots, as going all the way to win the championship. They almost went to the Super Bowl last year, and that is something. They were one play away, really, essentially. If that offsides doesn't happen, who knows, but they could have made it to the Super Bowl. And here they are this season, a lot of struggles, a lot of injuries. Patrick Mahomes, he looked good in the first few games, but then he got hurt. Tyreek Hill got hurt. The only person that was really consistent in the lineup at all was Travis Kelce. So there was a lot of people moving parts within the season. So their offense struggled a bit as far as their dominance that we saw last season, the superhuman ability of Patrick Mahomes as a passer and somebody who can create stuff moving out of the pocket. And he really didn't look like the same guy from last year. So fast forward the last 3 or 4 games of the regular season, each game he kept getting more confident, more healthy. The ankle looked a little bit better. And enter into the playoffs where they go down 20-something points. They go down 17-10. It doesn't matter. He is as confident as anybody else on the football field. He went from essentially a rookie, right? So if this was the NBA, last year he would have won Rookie of the Year and MVP. And this year he's basically this is his second year playing football. And he went through a lot of struggles with injuries and stuff, but now he's not just a rookie. He's not a rookie anymore. He's trying to transform himself into a leader of this team. And he does it on the sideline all the time. He looks confident. He keeps walking around telling his guys, listen, we got this, no matter how big they're down. They always he believes in himself and he believes in that team that they can drag themselves out of it. So that really translates well for the team. They just keep playing harder and harder. Not to mention their defense has improved so much from last year to this year that it's not even a concern as much for them to have to go and create every single time on offense anymore. I believe the pressure there's not a lot of pressure on the Chiefs, or there hasn't been, just because of the birth of the Lamar Jackson Baltimore Ravens. Chiefs kind of flew by the radar a little bit for majority of the season while they were just racking up wins and getting on without the national spotlight really being on them. And I guess it helps because the Chiefs are not the biggest market or in the biggest market, so they don't have a lot of airtime as much as you would think. And not to say Baltimore is a huge market in itself, but when you have someone like Lamar Jackson being as electrifying as he was in MVP race and all that stuff, he kind of became the new darling of the NFL. And everybody sort of forgot about the darling from last year, Patrick Mahomes. So now he's on this tear of, let me remind everybody who I was, or who I am, rather. So what are the Chiefs? The Chiefs are the fastest passing attack, I guess, besides Baltimore. And, well, no, they're the fastest passing attack because Baltimore is fast and physical, but they run the football way more. So passing-wise, the Chiefs, nobody can hang with the Chiefs. You want to know why? In particular, you have the best deep threat in the game, right? In Tyreek Hill. You have to always make sure you know where he is. You have somebody accounted for him at all times. The defense is overcompensating for his speed at all times. So you have that. He is going to take the top off the defense if the defense allows it. So what else? He's probably the fastest guy in the NFL, right? You have probably a guy who's a small tick slower than him. Right next to him in McCole Hardman. Two speed demons that play football. Like, guys who are super fast in the NFL generally are not quality wide receivers. They just don't pan out. They usually are return specialists, point return guys. But guys who are like athletic, freaky fast, like track team sort of speed, they just don't always pan out as quality receivers. These two guys catch the football and they're gone. Like they race each other on touchdowns. That's how fast they are. So you have that. Then you have another guy, Damian Williams, who is just a tick slower than those two at the running back position. And he can catch out the backfield. He was a guy that when Kareem Hunt was on suspension or hurt, he really stepped up, and he was just one of those guys who seemed to really get it going when he needed to. Then we look at Travis Kelce, bigger guy, tight end, still freakishly athletic in the passing game, and really fast and really strong when he catches the ball and doesn't like going down. Then you have Sammy Watkins, somebody who's a big wide receiver threat, not as quick, but he's quick enough, and he can go out there and catch footballs all day long. So, and he had a really, really nice big game from last week against the Titans, where he didn't really do much for the regular season, but defenses really have to account for him at times, and there's going to be no different in the Super Bowl. So you have all this speed, all these weapons. How can anybody really guard this? And then you have to remember that they spread the ball, and they're a pretty good running football team. So when you have all of this speed, you really stretch the defenses to like their brink. It's just hard to believe that there's a defense that really can hold them under 20 points. And when you look at the 49ers, their offense is not about going into shootouts. They had one this year with the Saints. And that was, I guess right now you can say it's an outlier. People keep saying that, Jimmy Garoppolo just has to be the Saints' Jimmy Garoppolo. Well, if he could be the Saints' Jimmy Garoppolo, I think he would do that more times than he hasn't. And he just hasn't done that this season. That's not who he is. It's not what this team's identity is. So they're going to try and establish their own identity on this game. But if the Chiefs, let's say the Chiefs stop them twice, I would not be surprised if they score 14-0. Like they go 14 up. And then the 49ers are not a good play from behind team, I don't believe. They're definitely a control the clock, control the pace type of team. And so are the Chiefs, but in a different way. When they decide to dictate pace, it's off to the races. They're the fastest team in the NFL, and it's going to, I think this is why I'm leaning towards picking the Chiefs, but I really don't know who can win this game just because it's old school football versus air raid, new school stuff. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. But I'm going to take another break, and then coming out of it, we're going to talk about some quarterback fantasy projections and stats and just what are we looking at for the 2020 fantasy season. And that's coming up.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
So when you look at some of the stats that we saw in fantasy football from quarterbacks this season, you see a lot of interesting things. Not all of it is I guess, really realistic, anything useful to a certain extent, but in the grand scheme of things, it is an interesting idea, or I guess there's a direction that the league is going for in fantasy that means that you need to be more attentive about. And that is the idea that if you can't get your hand, I believe in this, if you can't get your hands on somebody who can run the ball or at least create with his legs and pick up yardage, don't overspend on that quarterback. So if he can't do that, you don't need to overspend. You can wait in later rounds, and if he can, you have to think about just where that player will be in the, I guess, in the draft projection, in the where the rankings, mock drafts. You just really have to see where he's falling in order to really make a true true guesstimate of where you want to take him if you have an eye on somebody. So let's take out the outlier, which is Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson had 70-plus fantasy points over the next guy in most fantasy points generated by a quarterback. 70-plus. He had 400 and, I believe, 30 points in fantasy. Now, removing him because he had one of the greatest regular seasons I've ever seen from a quarterback. He broke Michael Vick's record. He was just ridiculous. So, in the top 8 out of 10, the top 8 are dual threat quarterbacks. So that means Lamar Jackson, that means Patrick Mahomes, that means Deshaun Watson, that means even Josh Allen. That means actually it's 7 out of 8 because I wouldn't say Jameis Winston is a dual threat. He can kind of get out there and run, but he's not as quick. But guys that can really, Kyler Murray was a top 8 fantasy quarterback. You see these guys using their legs and really picking up fantasy points by running and being as mobile as possible because it stretches defenses and it makes them more valuable for points. 4 out of the top 8 had 30-plus touchdowns. They're passing the ball. So, and these are passing touchdowns, not including rushing touchdowns. So, people like Dak had a really, really big year, right? And he's up for a big contract. So, we'll have to wait and see what he gets money-wise. But he had a outstanding year. Of course, we all know about the Jameis 30 for 30. Patrick Mahomes, I believe, had 30 touchdowns, and so did Lamar Jackson. Of course, Lamar had 36 touchdowns. So when you look at the grand scheme of things, these guys, maybe not Jameis, we don't really know. It was kind of an outlier season. I don't think I'd ever expect Jameis to throw 33 touchdowns again, but let's see. Maybe if Bruce Arians brings him back, it's how their offense is designed. They have extreme wide receiver talent, and they're just really talented across the board. But Jameis kind of holds them back with the 30 interception stuff. So we'll just have to wait and see exactly what that entails for them. However, looking at the other the landscape of the league in general, you just have to be able to move for fantasy. If you want to spend, so let's say auction or not say auction, let's say draft, snake drafts. You guys are going to be looking at your position in the draft. So say you are a guy in the middle of the pack, so you're 6 out of 12 or 5 out of 12, something like that. Of course, you're not going to spend your first round, your first maybe 3 round picks on a quarterback. That's what most people think. Honestly, if Lamar is at 3 and you're in the back half or in the middle of your draft order, why would you not think about picking Lamar Jackson? What can you think about that people are not going to reach about Lamar Jackson? Before, it was a reach. And honestly, Lamar was a steal because nobody was picking him in the 3rd, 4th, 5th rounds. That was the Patrick Mahomes stuff where he was going 2nd overall or 2nd in the rounds, and he was the first quarterback taken probably and stuff like that. And then there was Deshaun and other guys like him. Lamar literally broke the league, and now everybody is looking at him, licking their chops. He's going to be the first quarterback taken besides Mahomes, and it's not even going to be close. He's going to somehow get in the 2nd round. Someone's going to do it. And 2nd round is a little bit crazy, in my opinion. But the 3rd round, if his stats are anywhere near what he did this year, and he doesn't take a huge dip, that's a win. Lamar Jackson won leagues. Won fantasy leagues by himself. Why is that? Why are quarterbacks so gilded as, pay cheap The averages make it seem like quarterbacks, you don't really need somebody who is going to break the records to be serviceable. Now, of course, there's caveats and there's good logic within that. If you know that these guys are going to not be available, so these top 8 guys, so the Russell Wilsons and stuff like that, are not going to really be available, of course, plan ahead. So you got to be able to, if you have guys that you know you want in those middle rounds, of course you don't want to just waste a pick on a quarterback, so to speak. And if you know a quarterback, if you have an idea of where you're going to take somebody, of course you got to be more apparent, or more. You have to do a lot more planning around where that quarterback is going to be taken. If you're going to even draft a quarterback at all, you can pick one off waivers if you feel as inclined to do so. But it's just a thought experiment. Just another quick little statistic. Gardner Minshew was 5th in rushing at quarterbacks. He was ahead of Dak Prescott, Mitchell Trubisky, and Russell Wilson. Now, granted, Russell Wilson had 2 less yards than him. But it's just a thought. Gardner Minshew, maybe he's a guy that you look into. Maybe he explodes, maybe he doesn't. Who knows what happens with Nick Foles? Honestly, I think one of these guys has to get traded. I don't know where he goes, but that would be an interesting thing. Like, imagine if the Buccaneers traded for Gardner Minshew because they don't want to bring back Jameis. That might be something interesting to see. Maybe they trade Nick Foles. That would be interesting to see. For fantasy perspective, if Gardner Minshew is on the Jaguars, honestly, I'm in. I don't know if I'm all in, but I might be in. I don't know where I might. If you 7th rounder guy, he might be somebody you look into, because I would think by that time people are too nervous about quarterbacks and just start taking all the guys who are listed in that top 8. But Gardner Minshew isn't a top 8 guy, but the mania was around. I think he'll be good, because it wasn't like he was hot all season long. He slowed down, and he had time to, I guess, be a rookie. Now he'll be able to. He understands the highs and lows of football for 1 year. Guys who come in and are super hot and kind of end streaky, those guys are the guys I usually worry about, because they never reached the low point. Gardner Minshew definitely reached the low point and then came back, and I believe he finished pretty strong for the situation that he was in. So I'll look into guys like him. Josh Allen is the guy that you kind of know what you're getting with him, and if he can be the Josh Allen that wasn't turning the football over and wasn't lateraling in the playoffs, he's a solid pickup. But outside of that, the top 4, Deshaun, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar, that's 3 guys. But the top 3, those guys are probably going to be the ones who kind of get reached at. And then the next tier is, well, I guess Russell Wilson's in that tier too. So then the next tier is like the Daks and the Josh Allens, maybe if Baker decides to learn how to play the position a bit better, Baker Mayfield can take a huge leap, because I know he was going for steal or sleeper guys. So maybe that. And don't forget about rookies. So Joe Burrow might be a guy who you need to look into. Maybe Tua, wherever he decides to go. If he's on the Chargers, I'm buying stock. So, but we're going to take another break, and we're going to talk about some Denver Bronco offensive numbers. That's coming up.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football, from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? we've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
So, last season, I was one of those guys who drafted Philip Lindsey because I thought that somebody who had 1,050 yards rushing in 8 games last year, I thought that might be something to look into. I thought he might be a steal. I like stacking running backs in fantasy because usually somebody craps out. This year for me, it was Kerryon Johnson. He got hurt, IR'd, but I had Marlon Mack, who unfortunately he also got hurt. But I had Marlon Mack and Alvin Kamara. So I had a lot of options to go for. And I just like being able to be flexible because sometimes wide receivers don't always pan out. And, it's really quarterback dependent. And guys who can run the football, catch out the backfield, they have a lot of value. So that's why I usually go for in my drafts. Now, when I drafted Philip Lindsey in one league, because I was playing in a snake draft where I was, I believe, the eighth pick in the draft or something like that, or 12. So I was going down bad. I couldn't get any good running backs, and I ended up picking Julio Jones and Odell back-to-back in rounds 1 and 2. So I kind of had to make do with what I could at the running back position because at that point, it's more about picking best available guys rather than going for a certain idea. Because at that point, all the best running backs that you'd want to start off this running back horde that I would be doing were gone. So I drafted Philip Lindsey. And in 16 games, Philip Lindsey was 16 in rushing attempts, had 111 yards and 7 touchdowns. He got 1,000 yards. He did similar stats in 8 games last year. He had 1,000 yards with 50 plus more in 8 games. Had 9 touchdowns in 8 games. His attempts were similar, but yet again, 8 games. I don't really know what's going on, if he was just overrated or if guys were just teeing off on him because their offense was kind of abysmal for most of the season. Their defense was pretty good, but they were a tough team to play against for most of the season. Their record doesn't do them justice in how they played, in my opinion. They played guys tough. They weren't a rollover team by any stretch of the means. They just were not the best, and their quarterback situation was not the best. And honestly, when Drew Lock came in, Lindsey didn't do as good as you like him to anyway as well. So I really don't know what to make of Philip Lindsey. I would hope that he can return to a better version of himself because when he came in 8 games, he was really good, and he was a breakout star. People projected him to be better than what he was, and now if you look at some 2020 fantasy projections, he's looking at the 23rd or 24th ranked running back in the draft based off of if you're doing PPR or you're doing standard league scoring settings. So that is concerning if you are looking for a running back number 2, or because this is not, for me, this would not be running back number 2 numbers, just because he doesn't catch out the backfield, so you don't get any extra boost in PPR if you're playing PPR. So, and he doesn't score. That's the thing. He just doesn't get in the end zone as much as you would like him to. So, on the flip side, I drafted I picked up Cortland Sutton on waivers. Saved my season for the most part. This guy was Mr. Consistent, and if you look at the stats, he was not the best guy, but he certainly was not the worst guy, and I think he is capable of being a quality wide receiver. He's a wide receiver number 1 in the NFL. He's definitely their top target, but he is a good wide receiver 2 option in fantasy and borderline wide receiver 1 on good days. So Cortland Sutton last year was 15 in targets. He caught 72 passes, and he was looked at 128 times, I believe. That's how many targets he had. And I believe that kind of ratio can really cause for somebody to break out if their quarterback can be sufficient and really get him the ball. Now, he played with 2 different quarterbacks most of the season, and he was 15 in targets last year. If he gets a good off season with one of those guys and he gets chemistry going, who knows what he can do? He had 1,000 yards. He had 6 touchdowns, so that's not great, but he was really consistent. And if you did PPR, he got a good amount of catches to supplement you. So he was one of those guys who was going to get you 11, 12 points per game. And you love to have those type of guys on your team and in your squad because you don't have to worry about it. He's a plug-and-play guy. He is not a overthink on the sink guy. Either you put him in the starting lineup or you put him in the starting lineup. There was just no ifs, ands, or buts. And he was one of the best waiver wire pickups at the beginning of the season because he probably was not left on waivers very long after maybe the 3rd week of the NFL. And then guys like him and DJ Shark really had really interesting seasons, and I expect to see really good things. So all in all, we're going to have to wait and see what Denver does in the draft, of course. But I'm a guy that if I'm looking for value and I see Sutton or Phillip Lindsey at that 3rd round spot, I might reach on Sutton over Lindsey. I just don't think Phillip Lindsey is going to change anything about his game that makes it more valuable for me to pick him up rather than somebody else. And that's just kind of the end all be all of all of that. Like, he just wasn't serviceable, and it really left the bad taste in a lot of fantasy owners' mouths. Granted, I'm always a proponent that, fantasy is fantasy, but if he's a good team fit for a football team, they'll find a way to make him more valuable. That's why the decline of Alvin Kamara, I'm not too worried about it because I don't believe Alvin Kamara was set up to be what he was the last 2 years, which was an actual option on offense. Because when they ran the ball, the boxes were kind of stacked against him. He was not able to get shifty just because the 1-2 punch of Mark Ingram and him 2 years ago, or the last 2 years, were just so potent that when Mark Ingram came in the game, he also could gash you. So it was just guys were tired on defense. And when you use Alvin Kamara in the passing game, it was just electric because they were looking to get him the ball in the passing game. This year was more so they were looking to – he became a check down guy, and that's just not his game. He has to be in open field and able to catch on the run and be able to make somebody miss after the catch on the run and not somebody waiting for a pass. It's just not his game. You have to get it to him in stride for him to see the best version of Alvin Kamara, in my opinion. But back to Phillip Lindsey and Sutton. Phillip, maybe if he's a 4th round guy, I might throw a bone. But Sutton, look out for Sutton. And that's just I feel like I'm gonna take a flyer on Sutton at some point. I might have to do some mock drafting to see. But that is somebody who I'm definitely looking at. So we're gonna take one last break here, and we're gonna have a little bit of fun. I want to look at some NBA players, football comparisons, and just see what top NBA players I would like to see play football and what positions they might play, just to end off the day. So that's coming up.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
So Wednesday night, the world was of witness of what everybody was waiting to see. The first night of Zion Williamson, the number one pick of the 2019 NBA draft. And he got me thinking because, he's just a freak of nature. And we've never seen kind of a player built like that in the NBA. And every time I watch him, I watched him in preseason, I watched him a bit at Duke, and I watched him last night, of course. Every time I see him, I'm like, wow. Imagine if he was a defensive end. Because when he got it going, and he had a few flashes on Wednesday night where he didn't look, he kind of was being a bit nervous and not as aggressive. But when he was and drove to the rim, he had one where he just jumped past Aldridge on the baseline and took it to the rack, and nobody could touch him. It was just like I don't think anybody expected him to be that quick. So when you saw that, or when I saw that, I was like, imagine him at the defensive end. You couldn't stop that young man. He's 285, 6'7". He is unbelievable as the talent. I've never seen a guy that big just be so quick and so fast. And then it got me thinking, who else in the NBA would be super interesting to watch at different football positions, right? So, of course, right now I'm thinking Zion. He'd be a defensive end for sure. And I think he would have interesting success at a football career. I'd like to see that. LeBron, he was really scouted as a wide receiver in his high school days. He was projected to be top in the country. Or one of the top guys coming out of the country for football. And then, of course, he went to the NBA because straight out of high school, but he was one of the best recruits for football as well and wide receiver. But I think he would have been really interesting to see as a kind of a linebacker, not a linebacker, but as a defensive end. And he could really just the speed differential rushing the passer, or like a tight end, because LeBron is 6'8", 6'9". I just don't. No one's gonna be playing wide receiver at 6'8", 6'9", even though he runs like a 4.3, or he did in his prime. Right now, he's probably more like a 4.5, and he's a freak of nature. His athleticism is off the charts. He's 34, and he hasn't slowed down, or he slowed down his way of play, but his efficiency and his production hasn't missed a beat. So when you look at it from that perspective, I think he would be a really interesting tight end. I would love to see LeBron play football, or I would have loved to see him play football. That would have been so fun. The next guy is Steph Curry, just because Steph Curry is 6'3". To put that in perspective, some of the best wide receivers that we have in our game, so Odell Beckham, for example. Odell Beckham is 6'1", 6'2". Steph Curry would be a really tall wide receiver threat. And he's quick and fast. He'd be an interesting slot wide receiver guy. And I don't know if he would be able to take the physical punishment, but I think he's a tough guy, really. A lot of people give him a bad rep. I like to see him in that Julian Edelman spot, kind of be the slot guy. But then again, Julian Edelman's been kind of everything in recent time because the Patriots wide receiver core has not been the best. So I'd love to see him get out there and catch some passes, play some football. Steph Curry would be dope to really just to see him as a wide receiver. Of course, you have – I can't really do 7-footers in the NBA because they just wouldn't. They're just so tall, right? Who's 7 feet in the NFL? I don't think that there's a 7-footer NFL. I think there's probably something against that in the NFLPA or something like that. I kid, but I don't know if a 7-footer could really play in the football because his body type would just be, he'd just be all legs. And as soon as they take him out, he'd be done, right? Like the first thing is feet and knees for big men. So that would just kind of be kind of out of the question. So let's stick with like power forwards to the point guards, right? I would have loved to see maybe a prime Blake Griffin. Prime Blake Griffin might be interesting at a pass catcher from the tight end spot. I feel like a lot of NBA players are essentially just pass catchers from tight ends because they're so tall, or defensive ends. So maybe this thought experiment isn't the most intriguing, but at the same time, it's just, if you got to think about the quickness it takes to play basketball, everybody's moving, the conditioning is top notch. You have to be able to make such a quick cut and read to throw people off that route running might be really interesting and pass rushing might be interesting. So I would just love to see something like that. Rondo is 6'1", so he'd be a really short quarterback, but just the way he passed the ball, I was a big Rondo fan in his prime. I still like him, and I think that he is one of the smartest basketball players to ever play in the NBA. I would love to see him as a quarterback and just slinging the ball. I think he'd be kind of like Breeze, where he's so accurate, or maybe like a Aaron Rodgers, where his brain is just different comparative to everybody else on the football field, and he's just able to do ridiculous stuff. Like I remember when I saw that play Rondo did this year, where he faked the lob pass and went for the layup, and he faked it so much that LeBron, who is equally on basketball IQ levels, thought he was going to lob it, but then he realized he wasn't, so he almost blocked the layup attempt. That sort of stuff you just don't get from the average NBA player. It's just, those two guys are just mental basketball freaks. But I like to see that. Maybe guys that maybe like throwback players. Like I wonder what MJ would be as a football player. 6'6". I don't think he'd be a quarterback. I mean, there's some 6'5". There's been some 6'5" wide receivers before, like Vincent Jackson and stuff like that. Maybe he'd be a wide receiver. Would he be the Jerry Rice of football? Who knows? I don't know. He definitely was the Jerry Rice of NBA, because I guess Jerry Rice probably is the best football player we've ever seen. Maybe besides Tom Brady, because Tom Brady gets called the GOAT all the time. And then I guess the next guy before then is, well, I guess you got to do it by positions, huh? So Tom Brady is the GOAT football quarterback. Wide receiver has been Jerry Rice for quite some time. Tight end has been debatable, but a lot of people think it's Gronk. Then, of course, you have Lawrence Taylor at linebacker, pass rusher, some say Mean Joe Green, and all the other stuff, Pat Tillman, all the legends. So you just see a lot of different stuff. Who would be the best football player? I'm not sure. It probably, honestly, it just depends on how athletically gifted these guys were, because a lot of guys played multiple positions. I remember Nate Robinson he played college football and college basketball at the same time, and he was good in both. So some of these guys are just wicked gifted athletes at all different types of sports. Like Odell, for example, he could have been in soccer, in the other football. He was so talented coming up in the ranks, but he elected to play football. Some guys like Kyler Murray, drafted in the baseball in MLB, so was Russell Wilson. But those guys elected to play football. So, there's a lot of immensely talented players from all different levels of the game. But that's going to wrap up the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast for this week. Thank you for listening. Please rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you choose to listen. And don't forget to please follow us on our social media. That is Facebook, Instagram, and the Twitters. This has been Ethan Orfe for the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Hope you have a wonderful day. See you next week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.